Okay. Hello, everybody. Today is Tuesday, December 3rd of 2024. I'm glad to see all our attendees for this PICUP webinar. Back in August, when we were planning who we could invite, everybody who was at the meeting agreed right away that we had to invite Tor. So, Tor, we are looking forward to your presentation. So, I have to make the official introduction for those of you who are not familiar with Tor's work. Tor Oden is Associate Professor of Physics, Education Research at the Center for Computing in Science Education at the University of Oslo in Norway. Some of us are familiar with Tor's work, and some of us, like me, use outcomes from his research. So I'm super excited to have Tor today here. Tor is going to talk about teaching physics creatively using computational essays.
All right. Thank you so much for that introduction, Patricia. Thank you, everybody, for making the time to join this webinar, even though it's not at sort of the usual time. Here in Oslo, it's evening now. It's 8 p.m. And I will just say that I have sort of a general rule that whenever I have a meeting or a presentation past 7 p.m., I always do so with a beer in my hand. So cheers to you all. You're welcome to join. Um, so as Patricia said, my focus is on sort of different ways in which we can use computing in physics education, and one of the most long-running projects here has been this work on computational essays. And it's kind of fun to be talking about this today because this is something that I gave a pickup webinar on a few years back when this project was just sort of in its infancy, and now I can sort of look back and see all of the different ways in which it's developed. So before I sort of get into the actual project, I just want to acknowledge some of the wonderful people who are involved in this work. So first off are all of the wonderful people in my group, the Center for Computing and Science Education, or the CCSE as we call it. We have a wide spectrum of folks from physics, from computer science, from all sorts of different disciplines. We have a healthy stable of PhD students and researchers. And we also have an ongoing collaboration with some folks who I think might be a little bit more familiar to you all. Danny Caballero, who's a well-known face among the pickup crowd, and Devin Sylvia and the Michigan State group for computational mathematics, science, and engineering. And some of the work that I'm going to be talking about is comes directly out of the collaboration with those folks. So broadly speaking, the thing that I'm going to be talking about here is focused on how computation or computing is related to sort of this idea of providing students with authentic course-based research experiences and giving them more opportunities for creativity and agency, all within sort of the general domain of physics teaching and learning. That's kind of the high level overview of what I'm going to be focusing on. But to get into it, I actually want to start off with a quick story, little personal story here. So as you may hear from my accent, even though I live in Norway and I have a Norwegian name, I'm actually not originally from Norway. I was born and raised in the States, in Wisconsin, and I did my undergrad at a little liberal arts school called St. Olaf College, which, you know, occasionally Minnesotans and a few other folks have heard of. That's me, fresh-faced, quite a few years back when I graduated. As a person at a liberal arts school, I spent a lot of time, you know, doing physics, as one does as a physics major. But I also spent a lot of time writing essays and taking humanities courses and philosophy courses, religion courses, you know, all sorts of different kinds of courses like that. And something I noticed right away was that there was definitely sort of a difference between what it meant to do physics and what it meant to do sort of a humanities course, right? In physics, my problem sets always looked very similar to everybody else's problem sets, assuming that I did them the right way. And there were typically, there was typically only one answer you were trying to get to. There were maybe two, three different ways you could get to that answer, some of which were harder than others. Versus when I was writing essays, there was a lot of room for me to sort of think through, like, what argument do I want to make? How do I want to support it? How do I want to sort of go through this process of inquiry? And the essays that I wrote looked very different from the essays that the other people in my courses would write. So after I graduated from St. Olaf, I went on to,
Hmm.
whoops, my video disappeared.
Okay, good.
Sorry. I went on to the University of Wisconsin-Madison for my PhD, first in physics and then physics education. That's me. Later on, moved on to a postdoc where I am now at the University of Oslo, the CCSE. And as I was going through this process, I kept on coming back to sort of this distinction between what it meant to do physics as an undergrad and what it meant to do, humanities. And the thing that I noticed was that research very oftentimes looked a lot closer to this process of writing an essay, making an argument, supporting it with your ideas, than going through sort of a rigid problem set. And I think a lot of people sort of have this experience where what they do in their undergrad is not really reflective of what it actually means to practice in that discipline. So to sort of put it a little bit more succinctly, physics is a creative endeavor. We all know that it takes a lot of creativity to do physics. But our students often don't get to experience this creativity when they are taking our physics courses, right? So we advertise physics as this science where you will get to understand the world, you will get to break things apart and understand how everything sort of works. And we show off the most amazing things that we have built, like the Large Hadron Collider, and we sort of make these big promises, like if you come and study with us, you will be able to do this kind of thing. And then students spend all of their time doing this kind of thing. Right. So this idea then of computational essays of computing was an attempt to sort of get more creativity into the physics curriculum, to find ways to sort of bring in the practices of physics into the experience of bachelor students. And I want to be a little bit careful here about my terms, define my terms as a good liberal arts student often does. So I've used the term creativity a lot. I used it in my title. It's a little bit of a misnomer here because there are people who study creativity for their professions, right? There are entire journals dedicated to creativity studies. And that's not exactly what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about sort of divergent thinking, these broad, sort of loose, fuzzy things. I'm actually talking about something a little bit more specific, which is this term that comes out of the educational research literature of epistemic agency. And I view epistemic agency as basically sort of a way that we can sort of conceptualize and define creativity within our discipline. So epistemic agency is basically the ways in which students take control and ownership of their processes of learning and inquiry in sort of an authentic way to science. Let me break that down a little bit. So control and ownership. A lot of what our students do in a typical physics course does not give them any sort of control, right? They don't have control over the problems that they are solving. They don't have control over the methods that they use to solve those problems. They don't really get to evaluate what is a correct or incorrect answer. We sort of, impose those structures on them. So one of the ideas here is like looking for ways to give students a certain amount of that sort of authority or control. But it's not a super broad thing, right? We want them to be doing physics. We want them to be doing the kinds of things that physics people and physicists do. So that's sort of the scientifically authentic processes of learning and inquiry. And the overall goal is to sort of give students the opportunity to take up a certain amount of this agency, to take up a certain amount of this control. Students who do this, we say, are epistemic agents. They're, and here I'm quoting from a paper by David Stroop, who's a science education researcher, who studied this a lot. They're individuals or groups who take or are granted responsibility for shaping the knowledge and practice of a community. Right? Like as scientists, we have a certain amount of control over how science is done within that community. And the idea is sort of giving students a certain amount of opportunity to do something a little bit more in that realm. Okay, so coming back to computation, computing then, for a second here, I think it's really interesting to think through all of the different ways computing can enable this kind of thing. Right. So anybody who has ever written code knows that there's always multiple ways to write code. There's a certain amount of agency that you can take up based on sort of the languages that you use or your structure or sort of the different ways that you solve all of the problems that come up in writing code. Of course, computing allows students to ask questions, different kinds of questions than they would be able to ask with analytical methods or experimental methods. It also allows them to decide what kinds of models they want to build or analyses they want to do in order to answer those questions. And of course, these two are linked, right? But they're not one and the same thing. You can have a very very forward-looking question with a very back of the envelope model, or a relatively basic question with an extremely realistic model. And so they are in some ways two separate dimensions that students can sort of play around with. And finally, computing, and I don't think we think about this enough in physics, but computing gives you a lot of sort of agency over how you choose to communicate your results. What kinds of plots or graphs do you want to do? How much of the code do you want to share? How do you sort of incorporate code into a research report or a narrative or a presentation or however you are choosing to communicate the things that you did? And so, there's all of these different ways in which computing can give students opportunities to take up control, to take up agency, to be able to sort of shape the things that they are doing as they are getting their education in physics. So with that, I want to shift gears then a little bit and talk about this specific project that I've been working on, computational essays. I think some of you might have seen the previous presentation or might have read some of the work, so some of this is going to be recap, but there's some interesting updates here and there. So first off, what is a computational essay? In my group, we define a computational essay as a written document that uses both writing and code to present an argument, explain an analysis, or to tell a story. So the core feature is basically that you are using the code as part of the narrative. And this idea came out of actually this really interesting article I read some years back now in 2018 called "The Scientific Paper is Obsolete. Here's What's Next." It's in the Atlantic. And if you want to read it, here is a QR code. I highly recommend it because it makes this really important point that the scientific paper, as we sort of know and love it, has been in a very stable state for an awfully long time. There have been scientific papers that have been published in sort of the same form going back to the 1800s, and even some scientific papers that you can find from the 1700s, right? And there's a reason for this, because scientific papers are a very efficient and very well-designed medium for communicating certain kinds of results, especially experimental and theoretical results. But more and more today, a lot of what we are doing is computational in nature, right? Like a lot of scientific results now come out of pure computing simulations or models. And so we need other ways of communication that incorporate sort of that computational or that coding aspect. So computational essays then are a genre of communication that is designed to basically do this, to combine code and text into sort of a coherent narrative. If you were to look at a computational essay like the one here, which was written by a couple of students some years back, you'll notice certain things that you might recognize from sort of a standard report or paper or essay, right? We've got the title and introduction at the top, motivating the analysis. We've got text and equations to sort of describe the things that are being done quantitatively and qualitatively. We've got pictures and diagrams to sort of show the specific setup and the system that the students are analyzing. But woven in are these blocks of live executable code to do things like importing packages for scientific computing, defining model parameters, defining plotting parameters. And if you were to scroll further down, you would see plots and graphs of, in this case, a charged particle in a magnetic field, sort of different aspects of its behavior. Now, this is written in a Jupyter notebook, and being part of the PICUP community, I expect a lot of folks here are probably fairly familiar with Jupyter notebooks. I do most of my development and programming in notebook environments. But I want to stress that, like, even though notebooks are a common medium for sort of weaving together code and text, that we view computational essays as more of a genre, and Jupyter Notebooks as kind of a platform for that genre, in the same way that a standard essay is a genre and Microsoft Word is a platform or a template. And just to sort of get this idea across, there are several other software templates that you can use to write computational essays. So Mathematica, for example, is a good example. And here I've actually swiped this image from a blog post that Stephen Wolfram wrote a few years back, where he was talking about how awesome computational essays are. MATLAB has their own sort of notebook type environment that you can use. And if you click around on the internet, sometimes you'll find people who will present analyses on websites where they embed little interactive programs. You see this a lot in data science on the website Toward Data Science, for example, or in Wired. Rhett Elaine loves to write these cute little articles where he analyzes sort of pop science things, and he'll put like a little trinket in there. And all of these are examples of computational essays, right? In each of these cases, somebody is trying to present an analysis or tell a story using code and using simulations or data analyses as part of that process. One thing I want to add here is that in industry, this is also very important. So my wife is a data engineer. In the last job that she interviewed for, part of her interview process was actually to get a data set and then write a computational essay about that data set and come back and present that to the people who she was interviewing with. So like this is a common thing for students who are going out into the industry world as well. And the big idea here is basically like, okay, scientists are using this genre of communication. People in industry are using this genre of communication. Our students should be learning how to communicate through this genre. And so what we've been doing at my group at the CCSE for the last 6 years now, we started this in 2018, is sort of exploring how computational essays can be built into different kinds of physics learning environments and what kinds of effects that has on their learning. Um, the specific example that I'm going to be talking about today is taken from an intermediate E&M course. It's a third semester course at our university. It covers sort of like intro E&M up through sort of the first part of Griffith's E&M. So it's quite a large course. And in that course, near the sort of 3/4 to 2/3 mark of the semester, the students are given this challenge to use a computational simulation to investigate a problem that you find interesting and then write a computational essay about what you've learned. They're basically given an open-ended computational project where we ask them to essentially act like apprentice researchers, to define a question, investigate a problem that you find interesting, and then investigate that question, hopefully answer that question in some way using a computational simulation, and to write a computational essay about this entire process. So by the end of this project, what they turn in is a computational essay. And we also require them to present their computational essays to one another in sort of small sort of peer pods of, 5 to 6 groups or 5 to 6 students in a very sort of research group-like or conference-like setting where students will get 8 minutes to present their computational essay plus 2 minutes for questions. Or if they worked in a pair, they get 13 minutes plus 2 minutes. In order to help them in this process, we provide them with a few different forms of support and scaffolding. For instance, we provide them with guidelines for the project. We give them a document that describes sort of overall, this is what we are asking you to do. This is why we are asking you to do it. This is how you will know sort of the marks of quality. We give them a grading rubric, which we are going to be using to evaluate their work. We give them some example computational essays, which give them sort of a sense for what the genre looks like, for what kinds of things we are asking them to write. We give them some simulations that they can build off if they so choose. They don't have to. And actually, one of the most interesting questions currently is how many students are building off of these simulations now that they have access to generative AI and it can create sort of basic simulations for them. I'm going to come back to that in a little bit. But we also give them questions that they can build off of if they don't have any luck defining their own question. And we provide them with drop-in help sessions where we have a TA staffing a room, a few times per week during sort of the lead up to this project, and the students can drop in and get help with their code or their ideas or their writing or sort of whatever aspects. And again, basically the idea here is that the students are going to define a question, use a simulation to answer it, write and present a computational essay about what they have learned. So in many ways, they are acting like apprentice scientists here. I want to say a little bit about assessment here. This is always something that I think people are sort of interested in when they're thinking about incorporating this kind of thing into their own course. I will say that rubrics are extremely good for assessing this kind of thing. And we've made the deliberate choice to share our rubric with students. It means that pretty much every student gets high marks on this assignment. There is a very low failure rate. I don't know if I know of a student who has failed because they know exactly what we're expecting them to do. But in our view, that's a feature, not a bug, because that means that every student is accomplishing sort of the goals that we set for them. Here's the rubric. I'm going to take out some of the text here because the thing that I want to focus on is actually this first column here. So along the y-axis here, we have the different sort of super categories that we are evaluating our students on. And in this rubric, there are a couple of different ones that we've tried out. But in this one, which I think is the most enduring one, there are 5 such categories. So first off, we evaluate them on the quality of their investigation question. And here I want to say that we grade them relatively loosely because this is the first time that they have engaged in this kind of work. And as anybody who has supervised students in a research process knows, your first meeting with research is oftentimes a very challenging thing, right? There's a big jump from sort of standard physics student to apprentice researcher, and we're trying to sort of guide them through here. So we don't actually grade them particularly harshly on the question. The main thing that we're looking for is, have they actually defined a question? Is it physically meaningful? And does it actually require, real additions or changes to code in order to answer? So if they use a simulation, we want them to go beyond just sort of like twiddling a few knobs and dials. We want them to actually sort of work with the code, get their hands dirty. We grade them to some degree on the quality of their code, but here again, it's very sort of low threshold. We ask that the code works and that there are some kind of significant additions if they have used code written by somebody else or provided to them. We grade them on the physics they have chosen to include in their simulation. Of course, this is in a physics course. We want to make sure that they show off some of the physics that they have learned. But it's as sort of straightforward as, have you used something from the course, something E&M, not just mechanics? And is it clear how you sort of applied that physics, how you derived the physics, and how it was integrated into your code? We evaluate them on their conclusions. But here again, we want to make sure that they have sort of thoroughly described their results. They have thought a little bit about the meaningfulness and sort of the reasonability of their results. And they have sort of used these results to address the question that they asked. And finally, we evaluate them on the quality of their written report, although here again, we don't set very harsh grading guidelines, at least in this course. In other courses that use computational essays that are a little bit more advanced, they actually do set a little bit higher requirements. But here, we just want to make sure that they have clearly explained the steps of their investigation, and they've cited external sources, and that they've shown some kind of visual aid, some kind of picture or diagram or plot or something to help enrich their results. So we sort of define like a minimal viable threshold with the understanding that a lot of students are going to go way beyond that, and they very often do. Going back to this thing that I mentioned earlier about sort of creativity and agency, you can see how this rubric kind of embodies many of these features that I mentioned before, right? We have a category for code. That's because we sort of view coding as an area where students can take up agency. We include investigation question because we view, inquiry and question asking as an area where they can take up agency. Same with modeling. We ask them to sort of think through the physics and the conclusions that they have found with their physics models. And when it comes to sort of the communication of the results, we evaluate them on the quality of their written report. So in some ways, this rubric is sort of our way of taking these large scale design principles for epistemic agency and putting them into a concrete form where we're going to push students to sort of try and take up a certain amount of agency to focus on these different categories. Um, I want to shift gears here in a second and talk a little bit about sort of what we've found out from the research side. But before that, I just want to give you sort of a sense of the wide variety of topics that students address, because this is always, to me, one of the most interesting things. What questions do students actually ask? And there are so many questions. So many students will try and investigate sort of realistic systems. For example, just this year, we had students investigating the fact that sharks can sense fish using electric fields. How does that work? How does that work with sort of an aquatic environment? How strong does the electric field have to be? Or over here, it's very common to have an induction stove. There are very few gas stoves anymore. Students ask, how does an induction stove work? How do we induce current and how much heat does that generate? Moving a little bit more to the speculative side, a group just recently presented an analysis of could you cook a chicken by blasting it with electric current? Not very well, I hear. Even more speculative, could you create a particle accelerator by hooking a whole bunch of electric eels together? Could Amazon use a railgun to fire packages over the ocean and get to Norway, since Norway doesn't have Amazon? Or this one that I thought was great. I actually swiped this from computational essays. Could you use a cyclotron to fire a beam of charged particles and melt drones that were flying around outside of the Earth? Right? Like, students are given total freedom in what kinds of questions they want to ask and answer, and they really do take that freedom very seriously. A lot of them will take up questions that they saw on a YouTube video or they heard in a podcast. And because they have this freedom, they can choose, how speculative or how realistic they want to go. If you want to see a few examples of these, we actually have this online showroom for computational essays where we have posted some example essays that we wrote, and we actually have some example essays from prior students. These are mostly from the 2018-2019 sets of students, and some of them are in Norwegian, but it can give you sort of a sense for how these computational essays look. And this showroom is one of the sort of key things that we provide to the students to help them in this process. Okay. As I alluded to earlier, this has also been a very rich area of research. So I'm an educational researcher. My interest is in how these processes affect physics teaching and learning. And so in sort of the last part of this talk, I want to talk a little bit about the different things that we have learned and the different things that we are learning right now about how, taking up creativity and agency in these sort of computing environments affects students' experiences and learning. So one of the big themes that has come out of a lot of this work is that computational essays are a different form of assignment. They're a different kind of thing that students do than pretty much anything else that they do in their standard physics courses. For example, one student I interviewed, a lot of this study takes the form of interviewing students, spoke very highly of this. She said, it was nice that if I hit a wall here, I could just do something else. In a normal assignment, if I hit a wall, I just have to knock through it, right? There's no room to sort of go around and choose a different direction. Another student I talked to put it this way. She said it's like trying to program a problem. I think that was fun, and trying to how can we do that, and how can we do that, and the whole thing of trying to solve something. It's different than doing math, the equations. It takes a different brain capacity somehow to program. So for these students, the thing that always jumps out at me is the fact that like if you sort of set up a scale from like zero agency to extremely high creativity and agency, right? Standard physics problems are sort of somewhere in between, right? They require a certain amount of creativity, but you don't actually have that much sort of agency in deciding what you're going to do. Computational essays, they're much more at the higher end. You get a lot more sort of opportunities for creativity and agency, and at the bottom end is math. Um, Other students have also sort of spoken about this. So there was one student in particular, Martin, I'm going to call him. These are all pseudonyms. He put it this way. He said, I take these subjects because they don't require anything from me. In a way, I can just solve problems and be done with it, and that's comfortable. And the fact that this requires some creativity, it maybe becomes closer to the way it is to actually do physics. I feel like this assignment, it recreates the situation where one has to invent something. One has to find something to figure out in a way. And it's not often that we encounter that in our STEM courses. And the thing that really struck me about this is the fact that like this student has this sense that the thing that he is doing in physics is not really what physics is about. And that's a very real thing, right? Like what we do as physicists does not look very often like what our students are doing. Um, Interestingly, though, this student was actually upset. He was a musician by training, and he said, for me, who has been very focused on succeeding on these kinds of assignments in high school and always do them right, it can be very time consuming and stressful. I like to be done with these. It was the main reason I chose this study program, that one can leave an assignment when it's done and not have to think about it anymore. All respect to those who study creative subjects. I mean, social sciences and such. It's not so easy. Right. So this student actually chose physics because it was not a creative subject. It was a subject where he could just solve the puzzle, put it down, and not think about it anymore. And so for this student, right, like he views standard physics as being basically just math, this super uncreative subject. I think that's a real shame. I think we are doing a disservice to students when we are sending them this message that physics is this sort of like puzzle-like domain where you don't actually have to sort of find things to figure out. And so I was actually kind of happy that this student was a little bit mad at us because I felt like he had kind of gotten a little bit better of an understanding of what physics is about, and maybe it's not for him. That's totally fine. Students also have talked a lot about motivation with these kinds of projects. One gal I interviewed, I'm going to call her Lily. She put it this way. She said, "I think this is better than obliques." That's the term students here use for obligatory assignments. Obliques in a way because I think we pushed ourselves harder here than we would have with those assignments. Because then you have an endpoint like, okay, I've done what the program or what the assignment asked me to do, and here's that program. But now when we finished, it was like, this is really cool to see. What else can we do? And this is something that we see a lot of students doing. They sort of set out with an original idea, and then maybe they accomplish it, and then they say, "Oh, but what about this? Maybe if I do this, oh, look at this cool thing that came out." Right? They sort of follow that path of inquiry that I think is really familiar to a lot of us who have done, research kind of work, but again, students often don't get to experience. Students also talked heavily about challenges. And this was really interesting because the thing that comes up over and over in the students I talked to, when I asked them, what was the easiest part of this process? What was the most challenging part of this process? Over and over, students will say the most challenging part of this process was finding the right question to ask. And it's not hard to see why this is challenging, right? Because in doing so, they are balancing the factors of, how much coding background do I have? How much physics background do I have? What are my interests? What are the course expectations here? They're trying to sort of balance all of these different factors. And for a lot of students, they spend over half the time just trying to figure out a good question to ask. But here again, this is really authentic to research, right? Like the students that I supervise, myself and my research work, a lot of our time is spent trying to find a really good question that we can ask with the tools available to us. So in my view, this is giving students, again, an opportunity to sort of experience what it is like to do research-like work. Um, I think I'm going to skip over this next part or sort of blaze through it. If you're interested in this work, you can read some of our papers. We've actually done some sort of side-by-side comparisons of our design of computational essays and other institutions like Michigan State. We've actually coded, analyzed a large number of computational essays on sort of the degree to which students take up agency, and we've got different sort of narratives of different kinds of students. I sort of want to skip over to that because one really important thing that has come out of a lot of this work is the idea that your mileage is directly related to the ways in which you use computational essays, the ways in which you implement them in your educational environment. That is, educational design and student background plays a critically important role in the ways in which students take up agency. And it almost hardly needs saying, but it's an important thing to have in the back of your head. For example, when we compared our use of computational essays at University of Oslo to another course at Michigan State, a course that Danny Caballero actually has been involved in teaching, where they use computational essays. It's an interdisciplinary data science course. It involves students from all different backgrounds, and they write a computational essays as their capstone project. What we see is that our students who are trained in object-oriented programming, basically from day one, they have a really big focus on code efficiency and code quality. They take up a lot of agency around this. And students at Michigan State who are trained more in sort of code readability, in notebook use, in sort of communicatory aspects, that ends up manifesting in the ways in which they sort of, the things that they focus on in their computational projects. They produce these beautifully written, organized, documented, well-structured essays. Our students are physics students. They write physics simulations, every single one of them. And so, of course, in the process, they focus a lot on sort of the assumptions and the limitations and the breakdown points of those simulations, whereas students from a wide variety of backgrounds who are doing, completely open-ended projects from basketball statistics to chemistry to, sociological, political analyses, you see them posing a lot more novel questions, a lot wider variety of questions, and drawing on a lot more external sources in sort of their work. So the sort of boundary conditions here has a lot to say for what you can expect your students to do and what they're going to choose to focus on. I want to say a little bit about artificial intelligence here, because this recently has been sort of our biggest question. What impact is ChatGPT and other artificial intelligence tools going to have on student use of computational essays? And here I'm showing a picture of one of my PhD students. His name is Carl Henrik. He actually just finished, or hasn't quite finished. He is in the midst of collecting data on exactly this, collecting computational essays from the current sort of batch of students, interviewing students about their processes of writing these computational essays, and trying to get a handle on where did ChatGPT and generative AI come in. One interesting thing, just sort of off the top, we asked students to declare if they had used generative AI on their computational essays. In the set of students that he recruited, 12 groups for the interviews, I think there were 2, maybe 3 that had declared use, and in fact about 90% had actually used it. So many more students are using this than are declaring, at least at our university. So a few things that have emerged from this, and here again, this is like blisteringly raw data, so we haven't had a chance to go through it thoroughly, but what we're seeing is that students definitely use AI a lot more for this computational essay than other assignments. They talk about this. They say, this was the first time when I really had to use AI because it's open-ended. And that sort of pushes them to grab onto whatever resources they have around them. We're finding that they're using it heavily for programming. Some students also use it for physics to, try and understand, to make sense of physics, to get help with anomalous results. A few choose to use it on mathematics, but it seems like students understand quite rightfully that you really shouldn't trust ChatGPTs to do your math for you. Um, and students seem to oftentimes use it to save time, right? If they're under pressure, it seems like that's a thing that sort of pushes them to use it. Some of them use it for learning, and a few of them use it to really sort of expand the scope of their projects. But that doesn't seem to be super common. Some specific strategies, specific things that we're seeing students using. So on the unproductive side, on the things that they do that don't work, some students have been generating simulations before they really understand anything about the physics, right? They say, I have this crazy idea. ChatGPT, write a simulation of it for me. I have no idea how the physics is going to work. That doesn't fly very well. Um, Other students will paste in large blocks of code to ChatGPT. My code's not working. What's going on here? Sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't, right? I think any of us who have used generative AI have sort of had a little bit of experience with this. The most productive thing that students seem to be using is spending some time thinking through the physics first. How does this really work? And sort of getting an idea of how they want to do their model, and then using AI sort of for little bits and pieces of it along the way as sort of an aid rather than as something to sort of create a first draft for them. So there's AI is definitely in the picture now, but exactly how it fits in, that's something that we're still trying to figure out. And how we might want our students using it, that's also sort of an important question that we're going to be exploring. Okay, to wrap things up then, looking ahead a little bit. So I just was talking about sort of the first go at computational essays and AI. One thing that we're especially interested returning to this theme of agency is how does AI enable students to take up agency in their computational essays? And what effect does this have on their learning? Right? We could hypothesize that AI will give them many opportunities to take up agency, give them extra supports, but maybe it will actually take away agency if they become over reliant on it. We don't know which direction it's going to go. Um, Another thing that we're really interested in science, right? We are a community. We do peer review. We present our work to each other. We critique that work. We revise that work. One thing that we're really curious about is can we get students doing something like this with computational essays? We actually see them building off of each other's work all the time. Those example essays that I posted, some students will write essays that are like a rebuttal or a critique or an expansion on an essay that they saw somewhere else. And we're really curious as to whether we can turn this into sort of a core part of the learning environment. And then, sort of as a final piece, currently we have two courses that use sort of computational essays in the form that I've described, plus a bunch of sort of project-based courses that go a little bit further. I'm really curious as to which courses we can integrate these into. Can we integrate them sort of across the curriculum? And if so, can we start to move maybe a little bit more towards like a portfolio assessment model, like what a lot of engineering students do, where they create a portfolio of work that they do across their careers and post it somewhere publicly, on a GitHub or something, so that they can show graduate schools or show potential employers, this is the quality of work that I've been able to do over the course of my career. And here's where I started, and here's where I've ended up. I think that could be a really sort of powerful tool for our students going forward. With that, I just want to say thank you very much for listening to me, and I look forward to the questions and the discussion.
Well, thank you, Thor, so much for this engaging presentation. Um, I'll probably open the floor for questions if you want to unmute and pose your question, or you could also type in your question on the chat.
Can I ask a question?
Yes,
Please
please.
do.
Tor, you actually talked to me a couple of years ago while I was working on my own physics education research, and I've used your work repeatedly. So I was super excited to see uh, where you're going with this. The work I'm doing now, there's a lot of AI questions people have in the use of computer science. So this like
Mm,
intersection is a really big question to me. One of the things I'm interested in, the agency stuff is amazing, and the ability to go through the computational essays and code them so that we can generate data sets is helpful. Have you thought about doing any instrument analysis with something like self-efficacy or outcome expectancy, something that may
mm,
tie uh, to maybe DEI work in physics or sticking with
mm.
physics outside of the intro course? Is there anything along those lines in this regime?
That is a really good question. I will say that when it comes to sort of the more attitudinal assessments, it's not something that I've been super directly involved in, although I do have colleagues, close colleagues, who do that kind of work. I did have a master's student a couple of years ago who did an analysis where he implemented computational essays in a couple of high school classes, and I believe he did a little bit of sort of attitudinal analysis on sort of the motivational aspects that that promoted. Um, but honestly, I think that's just a huge and interesting and important area of work that I would love to see sort of written about, analyzed, published on. I think this fits in a lot of ways in sort of an interesting way with some of the self-efficacy work that has been done before, right? Like here, I'm thinking about, I forget what study it was, but there was a study where students sort of wrote about things that were important to them before sort of taking a class, and that sort of improved people's performance and sort of attitudes. And what we see here is that like students really bring their interests to these projects. When it comes to sort of sort of the DEI angle, one thing that I've noticed informally, but I think it might resonate, is the fact that a lot of women seem to choose biophysics projects. And given the fact that, biology is predominantly female, at least here, and I think in the States, I think there's sort of this important aspect of like when you open the floor to many kinds of questions, people can take, their interests that may lie outside of sort of the very core, narrow center of physics and bring it in and be able to sort of apply the stuff from physics to what they're interested in. And that can be a way to sort of keep more people in the physics curriculum who might otherwise then go off and branch off, outside of the kinds of things that we do. Again, I not something that I've personally done, but something that I would love to see you or other folks take up and explore.
Okay, thank you for this insightful question and answer.
Do you
Uh,
have any suggestions on, so I have students who aren't programmers, so
Mm,
that there are some tools like PICUP and MathCAD where you can do some of this. Do you have any good suggestion for tools like that non-programmers can get into this?
hmm. That is a really interesting question. Um, so, uh, when you're asking that, the first thing that comes to my mind is the example of the example computational essays that Stephen Wolfram presented, because his idea of, or sort of his conceptualization of a computational essay was a little bit more of sort of a conversation between the human and the computer around a data set, and sort of turning that conversation, that dialogue, in a way, into something that you could present to other people. So, like the thing that I feel like would be most attainable there is actually to use generative AI as a tool for plotting, right? Like there are certain packages, certain tools out there now where you can, in natural language, ask the generative AI, could you plot this? Could you plot this? Could you, show me this? And I feel like that would sort of lower the threshold, lower the barrier to entry for these computational essays, allowing people without very much coding experience at all to be able to do some kind of data analysis, explore some kind of question, and potentially put that into sort of a computational essay format. When it comes to MathCAD, I use MathCAD at St. Olaf, but it has been a long, long time. I don't exactly know how that would work, but you know, I think there might be something there as well. The tricky thing there is like the math is oftentimes analytical. It's not sort of like interactive code. You're not running things, but maybe I've been out of the loop for quite a while on this.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks. It was really interesting. Did you implement that for intro physics too?
So in our intro course, no. We wait until the third semester for the students to do computational essays. But that's just the way that we've done it. I will say, excuse me, in this course from Michigan State that I've mentioned a few times, that is an introductory course. It's an introductory to data science and a little bit of Python programming course. And there they use computational essays. And as I alluded to a little bit as well, we have tried them in high school classes, and we've found that the level of quality that you can expect from a student who has very little coding experience in high school tends to be of course quite a bit lower than at a university level, but they can do surprisingly good work for high school students. And more importantly, they can sort of experience that same process of posing a question and trying to answer it using computing.
Okay, so I have a question if no one wants to ask at this moment. So I wonder if you have had students writing computational essays in different courses, and whether second or third iteration becomes almost like a preprint, or almost like an article. So have you seen that improvement in the work of the students?
Yeah, so the way we do computational essays right now is that we kind of like the example that I presented was the students' first meeting with this sort of open-ended work. So everything is very loose when it comes to the evaluation. The next semester, our physics students go on to a course in waves and oscillations. It's called Physics 2130. And there they also do computational essays, but there the expectations are raised somewhat. They have to attack a problem that is much more physically meaningful. It's not totally open. It has to involve waves and oscillations. The quality of physics and the quality of writing has to be higher. Within another couple of semesters, students are given the opportunity to take an introductory machine learning course, and then quantum mechanics focused machine learning and computational physics course. And in those courses, they're project based, and students have to do significantly more sort of work on significantly harder problems with significantly harder computing. And then many students at our university go on to do master's degrees. Here it's very common that a student who does a bachelor's degree in physics will then go on to do a master's degree. And the students we have who are doing computational physics master's degrees have talked to us about how like computational essays were their first sort of meeting with open-ended computational research-based work. It was where they sort of got the taste for it. So we do see this as sort of like the stepping stone in a research process that gets them to the point where they're actually doing real research work, actually doing a master's thesis, and still, using a lot of the skills that they started building in their third semester of asking and answering a question, presenting their work in writing and sort of orally, that kind of thing.
Yeah, great, thank you. Alexander?
Yeah, I have maybe it's more of a comment. So I'm in Fargo, not too far from Northfield. And we have this computational physics course that I developed, which at first I thought was kind of different, but I think in the broad spectrum, what we're doing is probably quite similar. So we have essays that I write in LaTeX, using Overleaf, which is a different platform, but it's not that different what we do, and they do computational things where they include some of their code. You can't run it, of course, in the LaTeX. So it might be worthwhile looking into this, but yeah, and so they do like a lot of these essays throughout the semester, and then they have one big final project, which is again very open, depending on their particular interest. And we've had it's quite varied, the quality that we get. So some students really run away with it and do an amazing job, and it also seems to vary from year to year. So some years people really get into it, and after the pandemic, it's been a little less quality, I would say. I'm not sure if you've seen anything like this, but before the pandemic, that people were really getting more involved, and after the pandemic, I've seen students just kind of things don't work. Oh well, never mind. I go watch video. And so to me, it feels like, so I've been doing this for many years now, but it feels like quality is really kind of dropped since the pandemic. I hope it's going to pick up again, but we'll have to see.
Yeah, I mean, we saw the same thing, especially with the first couple of classes after the pandemic, where it seemed like they were hit rather hard. And now it's a little bit difficult to say exactly what's happening, because sort of the effects of that, whatever they are sort of overlapping with the effects of AI, and we're not really sure, how to disentangle those two signals. One thing that struck me though about the sort of the assignment that you described, like I think the notion of sort of doing a LaTeX essay, it makes a lot of sense for physics students to sort of be writing in that mode and having that sort of experience, because that's what they're going to be doing later on. One thing though that is a little bit important to us, at least for these computational essays, is that the code should in some way be like live and executable. It's really nice to be able to have a document where you can go through and you can actually like run the code and verify, first of all, that it actually works as advertised. And then you can start like tinkering with it and tweaking it and say, okay, what happens if I double the mass? Or what happens if I, change this? Or maybe I'm going to add a drag coefficient, or, something else like that. Because like when students are learning computing on their own later on, or in a research environment, like oftentimes that is how they get resources, right? When I'm doing machine learning work, I will download notebooks that I find online and sort of run them, play around with the cells, try and figure out how they work, make my own version where I load in my own data set at the top. And so like I do think that there is something important there about the live executable code aspect that we lose a little bit when we go over to like a static LaTeX document, sort of a standard report or essay.
I guess you want to mean that we are also changing the experience of the reader, right? We are engaging in a conversation between the author and the reader.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things I really like about these computational essays is that they are interactive, and the code acts as both a method and in some ways as a result. So in one of my other sort of strands of research, I do natural language processing work, machine learning work with a lot of sort of text vector spaces. And one of the things that I always push my students, and one of the things that I always try and do, is share a computational essay alongside any paper that I publish. So I have a paper coming out soon on a recent project. The code is both on GitHub and on Zenodo, and anybody who wants can download a computational essay that is written to basically guide the reader through, all of the details of the analysis from start to finish, show exactly how we took the data, transformed it, and reproduce every single one of the plots that shows up in the paper, as well as several plots that we weren't able to include due to space constraints. And this is something that I think if more people did this, it would make science a much more sort of open endeavor. And actually, a lot of the big collaborations, the LHC and the gravitational wave LIGO group, and a lot of folks, big collaborations have released these data tutorials. So like a lot of the big groups are doing this. I think us smaller folks should also be doing this.
Yeah, this is definitely, I think it's a type of tool that really enriches the conversation and the quality of the science that we do. We are exactly on the hour. Does anybody have one last question? Well, if not, maybe we want to thank you, Tor, for this wonderful presentation. And I hope to see everyone on the next PICUP webinar. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for having me. And if you have any questions, you can find my email. Please reach out.
Okay, so I'm going to stop the recording.